Once again, chapter 9 is a giant chapter that contains mostly information about Christianity, but at the end of the chapter they do once again tack on Buddhism. So to be fair, I want to again separate the lectures into two parts. I want to give Buddhism, their own voice, because once again, though these two streams of thought and these two religions were existing in parallel at the same time, one in the West, one in the East, Buddhism deserves, I think, its own treatment. So this will cover most of the information in Chapter 9 that is important about Christianity. However, it's not going to be exhaustive, so you do, of course, need to read your chapter. But there is a lot of information crammed in here. So in Chapter 9, we see kind of the effects of what happened after the Edict of Milan, which was by Constantine. So the Edict of Milan made it legal to be a Christian. It helped Christianity grow. Almost all the emperors after Constantine practiced Christianity, and by the late 4th century, Christianity became the chief religion of the empire. With the already in place administrative structure of Rome, the empire began to delegate archbishops as leaders over certain provinces, bishops in dioceses, and priests over parishes. Another radical conjoining of church and state in this time period pertained to the Petrine doctrine, which comes from a verse in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. It says, "You are Peter, and I build my church upon this rock." In order to silence any disagreement with the authority of Rome at the time, this new doctrine established that the pontiff was divine and someone to be submitted to unconditionally. Pope Leo came up with this Petrine doctrine and claims that Jesus intended Peter and each of his successors in the place of Peter to be the primate of the whole church, the rock or foundation of the church, and to have absolute power over faith and morals as Christ's vicar. And a vicar is like a representative, like the word vicariously, comes from the same source. Thus, the Bishop of Rome alone possesses the keys to the kingdom of heaven. He is alone the vicar of Christ on earth. He is the chief shepherd of Christ's flock. Being that the empire was divided between the Latin West and the Greek Byzantine in the East, this effort hoped to centralize the power and authority of Rome between both fronts. Now that the Roman Empire had become distinctly Christian, various sects of Christianity began to develop alongside various inquiries about the nature of Christ. This required that some kind of council be convened in order to settle disputes about church doctrine, leadership, and liturgy. So in the year 325, Constantine called for the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea was by no means the first church council ever held, but it was the first time that any attempt had been made to summon a general council of the whole church, at which, at least in theory, the church in every part of the Roman Empire should be represented, and it was by far the greatest number of bishops ever gathered together up to then. At the core of this council was the establishing of the nature of Christ, but specifically, it was a response to the controversial teachings of Arius. Now, there's a lot of times people will say, it was at this council that people came together and they decided what the nature of Christ was. But it wasn't really that they didn't already know. It was that there was a small group of people who were contending against the majority opinion of who Christ was according to the Scriptures. And so they come together not necessarily to vote on the best idea, but to have a democratic council of all the church represented to say this is what good, true doctrine would be concerning the nature of Christ, and this is what it would not be. And so it's kind of a misconception to think that they came together to make up, to vote on or decide what the doctrines were going to be about Christ. Because after all, if it was really just the the malicious conspiracy of Constantine trying to create this super world religion that he could dominate the world by using Christianity, he could have just issued a decree. He could have done basically what Pope Leo did about the Petrine doctrine. They wouldn't have to really convene a council. They could just say, well, here's what the nature of Christ is. And, but he didn't do that. They have a council. But what they were confronting was this Arian controversy. And it was one that was doctrinal at its core, of course, and it was about what was the relationship of the Son to the Father. In what sense was the Son one, quote unquote, with the Father, in appearance, in nature, in essence, or in some other manner? In what essence was he equal? And in what sense was he lesser? Was he eternal, or was he a created being? And if the latter, how could he possibly have produced redemption of the human race when the death of dedicated, fervent, and divinely inspired prophets in the past, their deaths did not serve any sort of, redemption for mankind? So how could Jesus? These were all the kind of questions being raised. The future Nicaeans insisted on the identicalness of both the fact that Jesus was divine and eternal, and he was also human. The Arians did not accept that Jesus was both of divine nature and eternal. They rejected that. So as a result of this council, Arius was deemed a heretic, and the Nicene Creed was produced. And this creed established both the humanity and the divinity of Christ, that he was of the same substance as of the Father, and he was eternal. And as you know, the creed is also in your textbook, and you can read that there if you want to. So one distinct aspect of the early Christian identity is that of the monastic movement. Monasticism was a dedication to an ascetic lifestyle, like a denial of self. So this meant fasting, praying, studying scripture, and celibacy, demonstrating many parallels to the asceticism that we see with Buddhist monks. The core of this philosophy is self-denial. Benedict of Nursia established the first order of Christian monks in 529 in southern Italy's Monte Cassino. Could be Cassino, but I think it's Cassino. Again, I'm learning my Latin again as we do these lectures. Benedict of Nursia was the founder of Western monasticism. His rule, which was a code of behavior, spiritual life, and monastic organization, was the most influential rule in the early Middle Ages. Little is known of his life except what is found in Pope Gregory's dialogues, which were written nearly a half-century after Benedict's death. Benedict's personality, however, can best be discerned from his rule, which reveals the intelligence and humanity of the saint who made allowances in his code for human weakness. The monastic lifestyle, however, was not solely restricted to males, but women were viewed in a much different light than that of men. Men took their vow of celibacy as a kind of consecration unto God and were likewise allowed to serve in the church. But women were not allowed to serve as secular clergy. In fact, the female body in the Middle Ages was not so much a source of controversy and discussion as it was of pain and fear and frustration for men as well as women. Women were perceived as the bearers of carnal temptation, their bodies physical reminders of original sin. We blamed Eve for eating the fruit and tempting Adam to follow in her steps, is what the general belief was. Even though, if you actually read closely in the text, you'll see in the book of Genesis that God tells Adam that they shall not eat of the fruit from this tree, and then Eve is created. And so we don't really have any record in the text that, theologically speaking, God ever told Eve not to eat the fruit. So really, I would say it was probably Adam's fault. Because he was supposed to have told her, and he was supposed to have said no. Remember, God said. But he didn't. So, and this is just speculation, of course, in the story there. But, Eve was considered responsible for introducing sin into the world. by eating of the fruit and offering it to Adam. And so the daughters of Eve was kind of an expression that was used to label these women dangerous to society because of their passions and their bodies. The passions that their bodies evoked in men, that they were temptresses, so to speak. And because of the carnal nature of women, they were forbidden to participate in secular clergy, or those who are ordained to serve the church in secular society. Instead, women assumed a monastic lifestyle similar to that of monks, but in a uniquely feminine manner. Benedictine nuns, not monks, nuns, trace their origins to some of the first recorded organized women in religious history, which is interesting. Tradition claims that Benedict's sister, Scholastica, who was later, like him, canonized as a saint, served as the head of a monastery. One very interesting fact about the monastic movement was the role it played in education. If it were not for the pockets of literature and the literate monks hidden away in their monasteries, after the education system of the Greeks and Romans passed away, it is curious to wonder what would have even come about in the West as far as intellectualism and education. In fact, the university system as we know it today is based upon the scholastic and monastic movements. The word university comes from the Latin universitas. No other European institution has spread over the entire world in the way in which the traditional form of the European university has done. The degrees awarded by European universities, the bachelor's degree, the licentiate, the master's degree, the doctorate, have been adopted in the most diverse societies throughout the world. Even the name universitas, which in the Middle Ages was applied to corporate bodies of the most diverse sorts, was accordingly applied to the corporate organization of teachers and students. Historically, it has grown to now cultivate and transmit the entire corpus of methodically studied intellectual disciplines. Where would we be without the monasteries? I mean, really, if you look at the history of the university, everything down to the way classes are held now, apart from the fact that we're, of course, doing this online, we still follow that same model. And we still use a lot of the terminology of chairs of the department, even down to when you wear a robe and a cap and a gown and you have your hat, and it all means something. It's all symbolic, and it comes from this movement in Catholicism of the university. Now, the Latin Church Fathers are foundational. I mean, really, Christian theology was built upon what they did, and they established many of the doctrines that are now considered normal Catholic and Christian doctrines. And so, being that that study was thought was at the heart of the rise of Catholicism, the early church or Latin fathers played a key part in the theological thought that would forever shape Christian doctrine. In formulation of Christian dogma and liturgy in the West, the most important figures were four Latin scholars who lived between the 4th and 6th centuries, and that is Jerome, Ambrose, Gregory, and Augustine. Jerome is most famous for his Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, which served as the official translation of the Catholic Church. Eusebius, Sophronius, Hieronymus, more commonly known as Jerome, was a scholar of both biblical studies and classical literature. In 474, Jerome gets extremely sick, and he has this vision of himself standing before the judgment seat of Christ. Wherefore, Christ ultimately condemns him as a Ciceronian, not a Christian, basically a pagan. And so in an effort to redeem himself, Jerome decides to follow this ascetic lifestyle. He dedicates himself to scriptural studies wholeheartedly. Jerome then moves to Palestine, and learns Hebrew from the hermits. In 382, he moves to Rome and goes to work for the Pope, and a year later he's asked to produce a Latin translation of the Bible. Ambrose is a very interesting guy. In fact, just very interesting. But he was born in Trier, which is in present-day Germany, probably in about 339. In Rome, Ambrose was educated in the liberal studies and trained in law. His education included extensive training in rhetoric because in the 4th century, rhetoric was the key to wealth and power. Ambrose conquered 3 emperors in his cathedral at Milan, and each victory was more spectacular than the last. He preached eloquently to Gratian upon the faith, blockaded himself against Valentinian II in a triumphant campaign of defiance, and he brought Theodosius, a name coming up again, to his knees to make an unprecedented act of public penance. All 3 of these emperors are reported to have died with the Bishop Ambrose's name on their lips. Basically, they died speaking of the man. Ambrose's unique record sets him apart from contemporary churchmen and defines him historically. His biography is studded with generals and courtiers and Roman senators. He was venerated by Persian nobles, Frankish chieftains, and a German queen, actually. His diplomatic reach extended as far as the Roman empires did. Ambrose wrote hymns, and in your textbook you can see a sample of one of his hymns, which shows some of the influence even of the cult of Mithras and its imagery, speaking of the light of light and things like that. Gregory the Great was born into the senatorial class. Now, he, out of all these, is one of the few that actually becomes pope. But Gregory the Great, he was born into the senatorial class, so he was already kind of aristocratic. He becomes the prefect of Rome in 573, and then he gives his wealth to the poor. He founded 7 monasteries, and in 574, he himself becomes a monk in his own monastic foundation of St. Andrew's in Rome. In about 578, he was sent to the imperial court of Constantinople. There he continued to live a monastic life, expounding the book of Job to the community in a series of discourses. In the mid-580s, he returned to Rome and became abbot of St. Andrew's. In 590, he was elected to the papacy. As pope, he concentrated upon practical pastoral attempts to improve social conditions in a period of decline in the old Roman Empire. Gregory was not an original thinker, nor was he a natural philosopher. His great achievement was actually simplifying and presenting for a popular audience much of Augustine's thought. As is likewise noted, Gregory is attributed for his hymnography. He wrote some hymns. And, in fact, despite the lack of historical evidence, his name has long been associated with the codification of the body of chants that became the liturgical music of the early church, Gregorian chants, which we'll touch on a little bit here in a minute. So last and certainly not least in this list, and I'm not sure why they were in this order in the text, but they were, we have Augustine of Hippo. Augustine of Hippo was born in modern-day Algeria, which means he wasn't white, he wasn't European, he was African. In fact, you can see some depictions of Augustine, and he was black. But we don't hear a lot about that, unfortunately, for whatever various reasons you could probably assume. Now, he was baptized by Ambrose of Milan, and he was ordained a priest in 391. He completes his Confessions about 397, and he writes another text called The City of God in the early 400s. Augustine was influenced by Neoplatonism, and he openly discusses the tensions of his dual nature in the Confessions. He was notorious for his crazy lifestyle that he lived before he became a Christian. There's a quote attributed to him, "Let me be chaste, but not yet." Apparently he had a struggle with sexual immorality, even as a Christian. The guy was far from perfect. In fact, I'll just go on the record saying that none of these people were ever perfect, and I think that's kind of the beauty of it. I don't know. Symbolism and early Christian art is inescapable. I mean, when you look at any religion, we're assaulted visually with the symbols, the artwork, the architecture. These things stick out because they're really how people identify themselves as believers in certain faiths and certain religions. And, this concept of the sacred and the profane is a running theme in religious theory. And in order to have a place of worship, something has to make something sacred as opposed to it being profane. And whether this is inscripting something on it, or building an altar, or painting religious iconography on this certain object or building, something makes it holy in a sense. And so symbolism in the early Christian movement is actually kind of curious, because Christians were very slow to express their religious beliefs pictorially, and no churches, decorated tombs, or indeed Christian works of art of any kind are datable before the 3rd century. So we don't have anything we can really find before the 200s, which is interesting. Nobody really knows why. It could partially be because a lot of Christians were poor, or the influence of Judaism, which was extremely against any kinds of imagery, which would be considered kind of idolatry, or we just don't really see much of a rise of Christianity until that period. And then you have Constantine and Theodosius and the whole Edict of Milan and the laws put into place that legalize Christianity. Nothing really happened. But after that point, we know for a fact that it exploded. And so the earliest forms of Christian art can actually be found as inscriptions of iconography. Certain iconography connected symbolism with spiritual meaning. Followers of Jesus adopted the sign of the fish because the Greek word fish, ichthus, is an acrostic combination of the first letters of the Greek words, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, or in Greek, Jesus Christos Theou Huios Soter. They also use the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, Alpha and Omega, to designate Christ's presence at the beginning and end of time. Alpha and Omega can be found in the book of Revelation. I am the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end, Revelation 22:13. Likewise, the key rho, which kind of looks like an X and a P, were the first 2 letters of Christos in the Greek. The symbol was popular in the Greek Orthodox Church, for obvious reasons. Likewise, there was a numerological significance assigned to certain numbers. 3 for Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. 4, there were 4 evangelists. 5 wounds of Jesus. 12 disciples, 10 commandments, and so on. So numbers had meaning and kind of had a holy significance in the early church. And of course, we see these inscriptions, we see some of this artwork begin to appear actually on sarcophagus, on burial sites, but most importantly, we can see an artistic expression in the architecture, which is kind of what we talked about when we looked at Rome and in Greece, the way they, on their temples to their gods, they would have frescoes, and they would have these inscriptions and carvings into the rock. But for the Roman architecture, part of the art forms in that era included the architecture of the Roman basilica. As with the sacred temples of antiquity, the Christian church consisted of a hierarchy of spaces that ushered the devotee from the chaos of the everyday world to the serenity of the sacred chamber, and ultimately to the ritual of deliverance. One entered Rome's earliest Christian basilicas, St. Peter's and St. Paul's, through the unroofed atrium that was surrounded on 3 sides by a covered walkway or an ambulatory. And an ambulatory is like a passageway that winds around an apse, Romanesque buildings often have chapels that radiate from the ambulatory, and ambulatories can be found in buildings as early as St. Costanza in the early Christian period as well. And on the fourth side, directly in front of the church entrance, by a vestibule or narthex, and a narthex was one of the most highly frequented parts of the church. It was used for a variety of purposes, both devotional and practical. The narthex was for those who were not permitted to witness the holy mysteries, most notably penitence and catacombs. So we have the ambulatory, we've got the narthex, and then the outer zone was provided, and there's a picture of this in your book, by the way, so if it's confusing, it's because it is, but it's in the text as well. And this outer zone provided a transition between temporal and spiritual realms. And so, again, we have sort of this separation of the sacred and the profane. Having crossed the vestibule and entered through the west portal, one would proceed down the long, colonnaded central hall, also known as a nave, flanked on either side by two aisles. The upper wall of the nave consisted of the gallery and the clerestory. Now, a clerestory is a row of windows on the upper wall, part of a wall, and it was meant to provide natural light to the interior of the structure. In the medieval era, clerestory windows were often filled with stained glass to enhance the building's sacred character. Now that would have been what's going on in Rome and in the west, and then we have the east part of the Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine. And of the most important structure in the Byzantine, without a doubt, is that of Hagia Sophia. And Hagia Sophia marks the golden age of the Byzantine art and architecture that took place under the leadership of the Emperor Justinian. Assuming the throne in 527, Justinian envisioned Constantinople as the new Rome. Supported by his politically shrewd consort Theodora, he sought to reunify the eastern and western portions of the Roman Empire. Hagia Sophia literally means holy wisdom. In fact, there is quite a bit of controversy surrounding the meaning behind Hagia Sophia. Sophia comes from Gnosticism, the vilified mystery cult of early Christianity, for which Sophia was a great goddess. She was said to have evolved at creation from the union of masculine depth and feminine silence. For some early Christians, she was synonymous with the Holy Spirit aspect of the triune God. She was Psyche, or the goddess within. The Hagia Sophia, or Church of Santa Sophia in Constantinople, was named for her. The textbook definitely did not see it relevant to enter into the controversy about the goddess who had a Christian church in her name, but one thing is for certain. Muslims took Sophia hostage and gave her a makeover into a mosque. Emperor Justinian built Hagia Sophia, and for 900 years it served as the seat of the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, the Eastern Vatican. Replete with shimmering mosaics and fine marble, Hagia Sophia was the single greatest architectural achievement of the Byzantine Empire. When the Ottomans took Constantinople in 1453, Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror, impressed with the great church's beauty, converted it into an imperial mosque. In the 1930s, she was converted into a museum. So now for a final word about music in this period and some final thoughts. As was mentioned before, Pope Gregory the Great is attributed for organizing chants, the chants that the monks sang. Hence, that's why we call them Gregorian chants, right? These chants were sang without accompanying instruments, which is called a cappella. Capella is the Latin word for chapel, so the literal meaning here is in the style of the chapel. This is because the monks would chant in monophonic or without complex harmony and melody, and it would echo through the cavernous chapels and cathedrals. Okay, so obviously this chapter is very dense because the first centuries of the Catholic Church were far from uneventful. They were pretty busy. To add insult to injury, the chapter again cramps Buddhism on the tail end of the chapter, as if there was not already a copious amount of material to cover. For this reason, I am going to treat Buddhism in its own separate lecture, again, so as to be fair. Clearly, the West's contribution to the humanities is perhaps more significant to those in the West, but giving the Eastern religions their own distinct voice is more than reasonable. So, I will follow up with this lecture with a lecture on the Buddhist identity.